Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, thank you. My name is Dr. Nicole Cook, and I am the Augusta Baker Endowed Chair at the University of South Carolina at the School of Library and Information Sciences. And so it is my pleasure to welcome everyone to another installment of the Baker Diversity Lecture Series. And so we've been running these wonderful lectures all semester, and we're going to finish out this semester strong. And it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Barbara Jones as our guest speaker today. Dr. Jones is the retired director of the Office for Intellectual Freedom and executive director of the Freedom to Read Foundation at the American Library Association. She holds a PhD in U.S. history from the University of Minnesota and an MLS in library service from Columbia University in New York City. She has traveled extensively around the world to present workshops on free expression, libraries and anti-corruption, libraries and HIV/AIDS information, and libraries and fake news. And that's a lot of the work that I've done with Dr. Jones in the last couple of years. Before all of that good stuff, she was primarily an academic librarian, and she has been a director 4 times, so lots of great experience there. She has written 2 books and several articles on the aforementioned topics. And currently, she is working with a colleague on a podcast about information poverty in the city of Chicago that applies to all parts of the United States. So, Dr. Jones, thank you so very much for joining us today, and I'm going to turn it right over to you.
Thank you, Professor Cook. And everyone out there, please let me know if you can't hear me or whether things shut down technologically. Okay. But thank you very much for being here virtually today. And I'm honored to be invited to do this. I send a message of healing to you, your families, and your friends. My topic today is based on my personal experience as a retired librarian who worked on intellectual freedom and social justice issues for 40 years. I am now retired, but I serve on the Board of Trustees for the Urbana Free Library in Urbana, Illinois. Next slide, please. Kaylee, are you there? Yeah, thank you. Champaign and Urbana, Illinois are small twin cities. We are small, but the University of Illinois is here and plays a major role in our demographics, level of education, and political environment. It is a liberal community with no history of censorship in the public libraries in recent decades. The Champaign Public Library did experience calls for removing Madonna's book Sex in 1992. But in general, when I was asked to serve on the library board 3 years ago in Urbana, I had little worry that we would face any censorship problems. Slide 3, please. The Urbana Free Library has a great leader, Executive Director Celeste Choate. She and the staff support American Library Association's Code of Professional Ethics and the Library Bill of Rights. The board is asked annually to review and discuss major library professional ethics and issues such as censorship. I am always reassured when we have this discussion that the current board will be supportive of Ms. Choate should a censorship challenge arise. I have witnessed other library boards in my past role as the director of the Office for Intellectual Freedom that did not support the librarian, and that's not fun. The incident I'm discussing today is, in fact, the kind of censorship that our kind of community is likely to see. A clash of what I view as two feminist views of transgendered issues and all that accompanies this important current discourse on gender and sexuality. We are unlikely to receive complaints in our community about graphic novels, for example, or books with bad words in them. It won't happen. We are far more likely to receive complaints about books that might reflect controversial or even outdated views on race, class, and gender issues or, for example, might misrepresent outdated facts about the environment. And I will discuss that later. Next slide. No, keep it on here, this one. The incident in the Champaign Urbana library community, not library, but the community as a whole, began in 2018-2019, not involving the library. It was a community reaction to an internationally acclaimed artist, Nina Paley, whose picture you see here. Her animated cartoons are included in many international film festivals. She is also a free culture activist, meaning she does not support the current copyright legal regime. She is deeply concerned about the role of social media in culture. As a result of her opposition to copyright, you can and should view her animated films on YouTube. She is a local, and her father was the mayor of Urbana at one time. She has her own blog. I urge you to consult it to understand the backstory of this conflict and to consider her own views, written by her and not reinterpreted by me, the media, or others. I apologize in advance. I'm going to oversimplify her ideas. There just simply is no time. As you can see from her blog and other biographical information on the web, and next slide, please. This is one of her latest films. It's called Seder Masochism, and it's about what she views as the patriarchy of Judaism. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is a cartoon from 2018. You can see from this that she is a feminist activist as well. She insists she does not fit into any category of feminist, and I respect that. But her positions reflect what I encounter frequently from second wave feminists. Certainly not all of them. She believes that women who are born as women with the female chromosomes, are the only ones who should be considered women. She bases this on the traditional scientific division of people into two genders, or a binary, based on chromosomal difference. She believes that some men, not all, who transition to womanhood are infiltrating women's groups to intimidate women. She is concerned about male power and male oppression in female spaces, so she does not believe transgendered women should use women's bathrooms and is thus opposed to the bathroom bills in many of the states. So you can see from this cartoon, she steadfastly maintains, if you talk to her, her support for transgendered people and the lifestyle, but believes that they should rethink their place in women's spaces and not expect to be included in some of them. And you can see her cartoon reflects that view. But in the statement that got her into trouble locally, she said, "If a person has a penis, he's a man." End of quote. It is included in at least 2 of her web posts, but the term had been used early by other feminists from what I would call the second wave. Because of her particular feminist views, Paley has been deplatformed in many arenas: social media, galleries, and theaters. In Champaign Urbana, she was turned down to exhibit her work at the Lincoln Square Mall. A film showing was turned down by the now closed but previously beloved Art Theater. Notably, she has been deplatformed at the University of Illinois' Department of Women's and Gender Studies and several activist and academic social media groups. Next slide. I use the term deplatformed to mean political strategies used not just by women's activists to deny controversial speakers or writers a platform. It could mean denying access to a theater, a lecture hall, a performance space, or other venues such as social media. And then Paley requested the use of library space at the Urbana Free Library after she had been deplatformed in many other venues. And she wished to moderate a panel of transgender and feminist women to discuss her concerns about transgender issues and free speech. And here's an important note. This was not a library-sponsored program that was planned and executed by the library. It was simply a request to use a library meeting room according to written library policy. So the Urbana Free Library approved Paley's request to use library space to have her meeting, and it was scheduled for Saturday, March 23rd, 2019. She was not permitted to show her films because ALA's Code of Ethics and legal strictures discourage the violation of copyright in a library. Meanwhile, the local community, particularly LGBTQ activists, got extremely concerned, and I mean extremely, about what they viewed as Paley's hatred of transgendered people and its possible outcomes that having her have her meeting there. So they too scheduled space for an event. Because the events were vying for the same space and similar time on the same day, Choate, the director, worked with the two groups to place them in separate, larger spaces. We all knew by the end of the week that this was going to be two very popular events. The LGBTQ activists expressed concern about the Paley event to Choate and began to discuss on Facebook what to do. Included on the Facebook page were some alarming remarks about using weapons. These were probably in jest, but a library director understandably must take these types of remarks seriously, and so the Urbana police and city attorney were consulted. While they advised taking measures, including shutting down the program, Director Choate decided to assume that risk and hold the two programs on the same afternoon but on separate floors. To reflect the library professional ethical stance of providing access to a wide variety of ideas, Director Choate decided to do just that, and Deborah Caldwell Stone, Director of the Office for Intellectual Freedom at ALA, gave generously that week of her time to work with Choate to plan for a successful day. The LGBTQ activists held their celebration in a room on the library's first floor, the entry level, with face painting, balloons, and a variety of pro-LGBTQ activities. The atmosphere was friendly, inclusive, with all ages attending, including children, and dozens of people mingling. And people tended to circulate between the two events, actually. The library provided book displays showing that the library does carry many books on transgender topics. The next slide, please. Thank you. And so this was Nina Paley's program. Does Sex Matter? Gender Identity versus Material Reality. Her program had 3 speakers and a moderator from the local paper. Paley reviewed her feminist approach to transgender politics. A psychologist recounted her attempt to transition to being a male and why she changed her mind. She changed her mind because the hormones started to have profound physical and emotional impact to her body and personality. She expressed a deep concern for her clients who used hormones and considered gender transforming surgery before adulthood. She urged that people wait. As a result, this psychologist has been deplatformed at her professional meetings. The third was a former male who completed a transition to becoming a female, including the surgical transformation, when she was a young person. She talked about the way some feminists had deplatformed and verbally attacked her for making changes to her physical body. She did not express regret in her decision to transition, but did say that being attacked from within the LGBTQ community had hurt her deeply, and that young people should exercise caution before making this life-altering decision. She decried the political correctness that ostracized even some LGBTQ people because they used the wrong pronouns or outdated pronouns or outdated terminology. The two groups held the event simultaneously. There were no violent incidents. There were no police. Senior library staff monitored the event successfully. Each event attracted great crowds, as we figured. Standing room only in the Paley event, and upstairs the celebration spilled out from their assigned room. And the library allowed that to happen and didn't interfere in it was a joyous occasion, really. Most of us had friends in each event, and the library staff did not all share the same views, but the staff didn't protest either event at that time, and they went on. After the event, Director Choate met again with the LGBTQ transgender rights group. They were very concerned that she had allowed the Paley group to speak at all. They told her that she was enabling potential violence and bullying to transgender people. This accusation, she reported to me just recently, has remained with her, and she thinks it will always remain with her. 1 week after the event, Choate spoke to a UIUC iSchool course, and the students were very receptive, and there was a very productive discussion in that venue. Although the event was covered by the local press, there was not a lot of written comment in letters to the editor. I think this is because Paley and her family are much respected locals because of her father being the mayor, and I think that her status did make a difference in this case, and it's something you should consider if you encounter this, is whether the person's a local or not, and their status in the community matters a lot. I had not met Nina Paley before this incident. Afterward, I had lunch with her and listened to her points of view. It became clear that we disagreed on a lot of points. Many of her friends disagree with her as well, but defend her right to speak. The library has not experienced any backlash from this incident. The Urbana Free Library was one of the first to experience this conflict. Before Urbana, the public libraries in Vancouver and Toronto, Canada, hosted similar events. The laws on hate speech and free speech differ in Canada. I don't have time to go into that today, but it is quite fascinating. And this debate is far from over. The Seattle Public Library experienced it in February of this year, 2020, and 2 protesters had to be arrested. As in Urbana, transgender people and allies urged the library to cancel the event, which was publicized as a critical analysis of gender identity, exactly like Paley's, that would, quote, make powerful arguments for sex-based women's rights, just like Paley's. But the Gender Justice League, one of the groups that organized the protest against the program, said in a statement during the debate that, quote, the end result of a hate group using the library as a venue to critique the existence of a minority group creates a hostile environment and is unacceptable, end of quote. The Seattle Public Library board meetings were visited by dozens of protesters over late 2019. On January 10, 2020, the Seattle Public Library Board of Trustees and Chief Librarian Marcellus Turner released a statement explaining why they were allowing the event to go on. It met with great controversy in the library world on social media. And here we are. Next slide. So, what are the conclusions that I took away from this, and what you might find interesting? First, I would say do some research to understand whatever the upcoming controversy is about. During the spring of 2019, I was truly confused. As an academic, I am accustomed to putting ideas into a structure. I simply did not have those tools anymore when it came to feminism. I'm 73. I came of age in the second wave of feminism, was deeply involved, but lost track of it after that. That is, of the academic debate, certainly not about women's rights. And so I did what so many librarians do. I started reading and speaking with friends, and I'll talk later about how important it is to have friends who are willing to put up with your stupid questions, because it helped me a lot. Here's what I believe I witnessed with my ideas backed up by the demographics of the groups, because I noticed that the Paley group tended to be older women and the rights group upstairs tended to be younger people. The Paley group included a lot of civil liberties activists who support the First Amendment for all. My summary is way too short here, but this isn't the topic of my speech, so it contains the ideas that helped me to understand what I was seeing in the two meetings that day. The first wave, I see it as waves of feminism. So the first wave was the right to vote in 1920. And of course, this year we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which gave women, I will say some women, not all, the right to vote. It is interesting to see in the first wave how three groups of women activists chose different strategies to gain the vote and ended up separating from the anti-slavery movement and abandoning the cause of African American women. The second wave of feminism dates, and that was my wave, are the 1960s to 1970s. It grew out of the frustration of post-World War II white suburban women returning to their homes after working in factories to support the war effort. If the first wave was about women's right to vote, the second was about that plus equal rights in the workplace. The National Organization for Women, led by Gloria Steinem, and Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, were icons of this wave. In fact, I still have Betty Friedan's paperback well marked up, but it's crumbling like cornflakes because it's a paperback from that era. These women also were concerned about domestic violence. But the key element of their activism was about male dominance. Second wave discourse assumed a binary world, a world of women, often versus men. There was a resultant growth in exclusive women spaces, women only, such as women only music festivals. There was a passion about creating spaces where women felt safe. So next slide, please. So now we get to the third wave that some people are calling the fourth wave. And it's not well delineated yet, but I certainly heard it from the younger group upstairs, celebrating LGBTQ rights. This change began in the 1990s, and some of them don't even use the word feminism. Women's activists began focusing on intersectionalism, the idea that each person, including men, has a variety of religious, class, ethnic, and gender identities. Hence, a transgender person might be a white upper-class person who in some ways is privileged, but in others is marginalized. Most important to this discussion, though, is the third wave's rejection of the man-woman binary. They have a much more radical vision of difference beyond a binary. So this reading helped me to understand what was going on, and I have showed in suggested reading some of the things that influenced me the most. Next slide, please. So I want to talk more about American Library Association's role. The intellectual freedom policies of the American Library Association play a key role in a library's decision making. And the newest manual of intellectual freedom is being edited as I now speak. Most relevant to this case study are the policies on meeting room spaces. The one to be included in the new manual is in suggested reading. This current policy was written with much input from the ALA's Committee on Diversity. For the first time in ALA history that I know of, there is an accompanying document called Hateful Conduct, which delineates processes that libraries should go through in order to host controversial speakers, but at the same time respect inclusiveness, which is a tough balancing act. I applaud this new document. The perennial conflict in libraries is of balancing individual rights with social justice for marginalized communities. In the transgender case, it is the conflict between a person like Paley's right to speak, even if her speech is considered hateful by some groups, versus that group's right to use the library as an open, safe, and inclusive space. It is the primary conflict I have struggled with personally and professionally for 40 years. It has kept me interested in this field probably till the day I die. I believe that we need more work in this arena to create a dynamic space and an arena where these issues can be discussed without rancor. But it's hard and it's painful, but it's very important work. Next slide, please. Okay, so American Libraries Association's work is based on legal precedent and consideration of the legal risk of libraries. That's one of many ways one can approach intellectual freedom and free speech issues. But I still recommend that even if you think the First Amendment was written by a privileged class of white men who did not consider the oppression of speech on marginalized people, which is a very valid concern, but I still recommend librarians use this legal framework for their arguments and actions for change, because the rule of law is one of the few things that most of us still share. And now in our history is not the time to take on a revision of the Constitution. It makes our arguments understandable and actionable within a recognized framework. Yes, there are other frameworks, which is why I applaud the inclusion of the hateful conduct arguments now. In the real world, also, libraries can still be sued for not upholding the legal framework. For example, a small town library in Missouri that installed a computer filter that discriminated on the basis of ideas was successfully sued for $125,000. Within the rule of law framework, deplatforming is considered prior restraint, a legal term to describe the prevention of speech. In the past, it often applied more to government review boards deciding which books or films could be released to the public. Now, the impact of prior restraint has expanded. So, in your arguments about speech considered to be hateful, it is important to use this framework, and then, if you disagree with it, propose another framework. Next slide, please. I urge diversity activists to give people space to express themselves and to ask questions, even if these questions are outdated. For example, in a recent discussion in this community about undocumented immigrants, a man in overalls, clearly not from the usual suspects of this liberal community, sat down in a group and said, "My wife is an illegal immigrant." He was chastised for using the word illegal to the point that he left. I think this was extremely unfortunate and that we should avoid this kind of political correctness. There are so many better ways that this could have been handled. He could have learned something, and then he could have stayed and he would have learned something. Everybody would have learned more. This goes for people who do not mean to be hurtful, but who ask questions like, "Aren't transgender people really just gay?" Do not ask them to leave. Do not ignore them. Explain the current discourse about gender versus sex. This was a major issue in this community. People just did not understand the difference between the two groups. And as one attendee, Patch Adams, the famous physician and clown, said at the Paley program, "Remember that to the general public, both groups are the same. Both groups are transgender. Both groups are LGBTQ. And both groups are hated equally by many out there who would think this argument is splitting hairs." Next slide. And finally, I'll end with practical advice for new librarians. Research your community. If you are job seeking, research the community ahead of time. Know that if you work in a publicly funded library, that library is subject to the First Amendment. If you are in a private library or a library of a religious organization, you do not have First Amendment protections. Then you should ask for the institution's code of conduct or academic freedom statements. ALA's Office for Intellectual Freedom still receives many calls from librarians in religious institutions. For example, one librarian who was told he had to shut down his after-school manga comics club because the content violated religious principles, and there was not much we could do for him. Some private institutions do follow First Amendment principles because they would have a hard time attracting new staff if they didn't, but you need to ask if this matters to you. Ask questions about the library board. In recent years, some boards have stealth members elected or appointed to represent special interest groups. And in censorship battles, the board's ties to the community become invaluable because many of us are embedded in our communities. And finally, cultivate allies. This might be a youth pastor, the ACLU, the police for sure, the mayor, and others. Become more than a face or a name on an organization chart. I applaud libraries that require librarians to go out in their communities and attend community events and meetings. If the local barbershop is where community issues are discussed, then the librarian should go there. Be in a trusted status so that if a community member says to you, "That library program that Paley's giving sounds weird, but it's okay, right?" And then you can answer yes or no. Explain it in terms understandable to that person and invite them to attend. So thank you for your attention. Be well, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Jones. This was so interesting and so much food for thought. So I'm going to ask you a question and give folks an
Right.
opportunity to get their questions in the box. I was so glad that you mentioned the controversy with Seattle. That is
Yeah.
not certainly not exclusive to them.
Yeah.
My question about that is, I guess, it's kind of two-pronged. And you mentioned some of the controversy even among the profession. How do we, as information professionals, how are we supposed to essentially get our patrons and communities on board when we ourselves, as a professional community, don't agree on a lot of topics, not just this one?
Yeah.
And then, the second prong is the group that was trying to use the space in Seattle. They have been known to intentionally try and get spaces in libraries. They're trying to be controversial. It's not
Yeah.
just solely that they need a space for their meeting. They're trying to be provocative. They're actually trying to see what libraries and their boards will do.
Uh-huh.
So it's a very big question, two prongs. Just curious on your thoughts about that.
On my thoughts, yes, for sure. I'll take the second one for
Hmm.
well, I can't remember which one it was, but they're
Yeah.
great questions. And I would say it is rare these days to have whatever the library community in quotes is, to have it as one voice anymore. There is real division within the library community on issues involving what I would call the civil liberties argument about the right of any individual to free speech versus social justice and the right of groups of people, marginalized groups especially, to feel safe in a library space. And right now, I would say the best way to go is and it's tough. And one of the best ways to get on board is to use ALA's legal arguments. And then you can always fall back on saying, well, ALA has said thus and so. And I think it's easier now because while the First Amendment does prefer, I would say, does, I mean, the ideal with that is free speech for all, whereas there isn't as much attention to, well, how does that speech hurt? What is the impact of that speech to hurting individuals? Now, if it's violence, if it's physical violence, that's one thing. Physical violence is prohibited, but we know more now about how non-physical violence deeply hurts and traumatizes people. So I'm glad that ALA has added the hateful conduct piece to the argument, and it's in your suggested reading, and I would highly recommend you look at this. So if I were talking to a community now, about this, I would say we acknowledge that this speech may hurt some people, may not be that, but that this they do have a right to free speech. Because if you start violating the Constitution, I think you get into a lot of trouble in being sued by the ACLU or other people. Although I will say that I haven't seen the ACLU take on issues like this. So I think a lot of us are trying to stand back at this point and hope that nothing happens. Like, I know Celeste Choate at Urbana Free Library did that. She she tried to balance it and to give both sides a way to speak. And fortunately, there haven't been any incidents or anything. But I guess I don't have a precise answer to that, except that I think there's more room now for considering how speech might traumatize people, and that maybe a follow-up, if there is real residual hurt, which we haven't heard a lot about, I have to say, in the past year, but just make really sure that you have programming about transgender people and the issues, and that you have books and information about them. And I would say answer questions if you have some transgender people in your community who, I know it's a pressure on them because they get asked all the time, but if some of them will help, it really helps the community. Um, in terms of Seattle and groups that deliberately go around like this, I encountered this with an anti-immigrant group and a group that is anti-porn on the internet at Orland Park Library in Orland Park, Illinois. It was a group of Tea Party activists in the state of Illinois. They were from southern Illinois, and Orland Park is in the Chicago suburbs. And they traveled around the state and tried to get libraries to hear them about that the internet should not be in libraries because there is pornography on the internet. And they would, in order to get their point across, they would ask libraries to, they would invoke the Freedom of Information Act, so that Orland Park Library, for example, had to spend $120,000 on photocopying. They were really killing the libraries with book budgets with photocopying requests. And in one, a library accidentally photocopied human resources folders. And so all this information about libraries was put out there. So I would highly recommend, in a case like this, that if you have concerns about a group that is doing this kind of thing, you contact Deborah Caldwell Stone at the Office for Intellectual Freedom in Chicago, because she and I had direct experience with this at Orland Park. There are some things the Attorney General of your state can do. For example, overuse of the Freedom of Information Act, or certainly violating personnel, getting into personnel files is just absolutely illegal. So there are some things that you can do to make it clear to some of these people that you are watching. Another thing you can do, I know the board in Urbana, we have a policy that people can be on the phone to call in. And at Orland Park, they did not. And so there was one man in New Jersey who tried to be in on the Orland Park board meetings every single month. And because the board bylaws said you have to be here in person, he couldn't appear. And I have to say, every month for a while when I was here in Urbana, I thought, oh, he's going to call us because we do allow it. And that's another thing to consider. So, Nicole, I have a question for you about the Seattle incident, if you don't mind. I mean, Professor Cook, I'm sorry.
Mhm.
I have a question about Marcellus Turner because, and I don't know him. Do you know him?
I don't, not
Okay.
personally.
Yeah, I wonder what it's like for a person of color to have to deal with something like this and whether it matters whether that makes a difference.
Personally, I think it absolutely matters.
Hmm?
And this is not to say that a library director that's not a person of color would not,
Yeah.
face scrutiny or criticism, etc. But when we have people of color in the library profession, particularly in library leadership, it's just an added dimension. It's just an added lever for criticism, and this idea that you're not really qualified, you don't know what you're doing. So there's always some subtext, some subcontext happening. So
Hmm.
I'm sure that that's coming up for him as well.
Okay. Yeah. I don't know him either, and I don't know any of the after effects, but I was curious about that.
Mhm.
So thank
So I
you.
have, yeah, no problem. I have a comment, and then I'm
Mhm.
going to put forth two questions by Dylan.
Okay.
So Bean Yogi has a
Yeah.
comment. And I've met Bean at different events. I think the last time was at when ALA was in Seattle. So Bean has a comment and says, when public libraries host trans exclusionary events in their spaces, the broken trust between libraries and trans communities goes deep. With respect, having trans oriented programs and materials are not enough to counter the impact of hosting such violent rhetoric in public library spaces. Speaking as a public library worker in Seattle, who is
Ah,
also trans, I
hmm.
saw this firsthand with members of my communities.
Hmm. Um, Thank you for these remarks because, of course, this is one of the things we have to encounter, and that um, the impact is very real. And I would also say that within the Champaign Urbana community, and the public library works closely with the schools, and after school the libraries are packed with students from our local schools because of where the library is located. We would do our very best to make sure that we create an inclusive environment. I don't know what else to say except that we certainly heard this from the group upstairs, and I'm sure this controversy isn't over. But I want to thank you for your suggestions, and if you have any comments for us about what you think we should do in a case like this, if you want to type that in or speak to this or not, okay?
Or if Bean decides that they want to do that,
Yeah.
maybe they can email you or contact
Yes,
you offline.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I am BMJ Consulting, one word, at gmail.com.
Okay, thank you for that.
Yeah,
And so Dylan's questions are going back to your discussions about being a board member.
yes.
So Dylan's first question is, why are they called stealth members? You mentioned
Oh,
having
yeah.
board members.
Okay. Okay, thank you for your question. We're seeing increasingly that groups in town, like let's say um, the National Rifle Association could be one. It could be a group very concerned about content of books that maybe, let's say it's a religious group in town worried about witchcraft or immorality in books. That groups of people in a town can get together and decide to run a board member or to pressure a mayor to appoint this board member. Board members like this come to the board with one specific thing in mind: to censor books or to try to promote censorship or to limit access. It could be a racist board member. It could be somebody who is really anti-diversity, and you could get that. And it's really good to recognize. I've always said that politics is local. It starts local. And you really need to read the descriptions of who you're putting on your city council, on your county board, on your library board, on your school board, because we had a huge problem issue in the Urbana schools with a very controversial issue with the superintendent who was dismissed as a result. And so that's what a stealth candidate is. It's somebody who comes with an agenda.
So essentially, it's a ringer.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Hmm.
Dylan's second question: have there
Yes.
been any issues of harassment under the guise of protest or in library meetings that you have observed?
Protests. Not there have been protests in libraries, and I know that Urbana has a policy. One of the things you can do is go back to, and again, it's a legal concept, and I think that's still a concept that's valid, even though it's got its issues. But libraries, legally defined, are public forums, meaning that they have to be open to everybody and nobody gets special privileges. You can't say white people only. You can't say gays aren't allowed, anything like that. It's open to everybody. But there are limits to that. And those limits are time, place, and manner. So you can have hours. In other words, you don't have to be open all night. That's time. And in terms of manner, you can say that there have to be places in the library that can't be disrupted. And so if a protest within a library disrupts the rest of the patrons, the rest of the people in there, it can be disallowed. The library director or a guard could say, this is too noisy, you're disturbing people. Here's the key. It has to be applied to every protest, not just protests against trans people, not just protests for something. It has to be applied equally. And so that's when it becomes a problem. I can give you another example. There was a very famous case in Morristown, New Jersey, a gazillion years ago, but it still applies, of a homeless man who came to the library and who smelled. And the library wanted to get rid of him because of his odor. If you're gonna, and I'm not suggesting that this is a good strategy, but I'm saying legally, if you decide somebody needs to talk to him and that the odor is offending people, you also have to talk to a person, maybe an upper class lady who is beautifully dressed, whose perfume is too strong. You can't discriminate against the homeless person, and you have to treat everybody equally. So I hope that helps a little bit.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a legendary case in Morristown, New Jersey.
Yeah.
Okay. So Barbara, there's a comment from Seisha Orange.
Yes.
And Seisha says, I appreciate your recommendations for librarians. It is important that librarians not view outreach as standing in the building and quote unquote reaching out. My
Yeah. Hi, Sasha. Yeah.
my recommendation is that librarians be a part of the community throughout the
Yes.
community.
Yes.
Thus, knowledge of community is more valid and recognizable. Not only the uh, Okay, so not only the board, I got it now. Not only the board makeup, but know the board too.
Yeah.
They need to know you as programming for community and be very familiar with library policy, and don't spring programs on them.
Yes. Absolutely. I can't agree more. I mentioned the board because you do need to know the board, and yes, there shouldn't be surprises at all. And certainly, Celeste Choate and I worked very closely the week before. And Celeste is the president of the Urbana Rotary Club. She goes to Chamber of Commerce breakfasts. She is deeply embedded in the community. And when I talked about trust before, it's absolutely true. People and Rotary, of course, includes a lot of our religious community, a lot of the pastors. She had a lot of credibility when this happened, and people were willing to say, "Well, if she says it's okay." I know she follows library policy. I know she follows ALA Code of Ethics. They trusted her, and that you have to build it ahead of time. You have to. I know when I was in Hartford, Connecticut, when librarians signed a contract, they were assigned an area and they had to go to community meetings, they had to go to city council meetings and know who the city council person was in their community. They actually went to barbershops. I mean, that's why I use that example. They go where people congregate. And I can't agree more. Get out of the building and, and do what you need to do to be embedded in your community.
Thank you. And also, I would add, stay in the community,
Yes.
right? It's not
Yes,
just a one-time deal.
exactly.
Okay, Emily has a question.
Yes.
Emily says, if possible, do you have any more subtle examples of such controversial issues at public libraries? I've only worked at my library branch for 3 years, but I've
Mhm.
yet to see any such controversies. I am open to the possibility that they're under my radar because they're not as sensational or because I have yet to have the critical tools to recognize them.
Okay, great question. I would say that the there are subtle things, and let me give you one example. You could have, and these are examples from my time at ALA. You can have volunteers who are reading to children but are refusing to read certain books to children because the volunteers think they're immoral, or the volunteers this is a famous one, that white kids don't want books about black kids. They think that black kids, if you've got African American kids at a story time, you read African American books to them and you read white topic books to white kids. And I there's not a rule for this exactly, except it's just unethical. It's just not good library practice. And so this can happen with people not being aware. So I would say that a library director needs to be really careful about volunteers. Volunteers can also be proselytizing religion, and that's one thing that is subtle. It can be subtle. The other thing is somebody, the person who does the collection development can refuse to buy books on certain topics. And the person who is weeding a collection can weed books by, let's say, a strict, maybe your library has a policy like if this book isn't checked out three times, then it gets weeded. And my response to that is a lot of books are seasonal. A lot of books, we found that when we did research on this, that a lot of books about people of color and diverse communities got weeded. And so I don't think that's a good way to weed books. A better way would be books that aren't being read is to make a display or read them at a story time or something like that to make people aware of these books rather than saying, well, nobody read it, we're going to weed it. So those are two subtle examples that I can give you. And yeah, I would, if you have any more questions, but I hope that helps a little. So,
Thank you, Barbara, or excuse me, Dr. Jones. I would add to that, to your examples, a lot of this are issues of uh, continuing education and training that we in the library profession need to
mm,
do
yeah.
about implicit bias, cultural competence. Emily and the students in my class, I have an article called "White Kids Need Diverse Books Too." That
Uh,
if one of you reminds me, I'll post it to
uh,
our course shell. But a lot of this is some of the self work that librarians need to do and need to continue to do.
mhm.
It's not simply about checkout numbers or
Yeah,
you know saying that, well, my community is 99.9% white. There is no community at this point that is 99.9%
right,
white. And if
right.
if if we think that, that means we really don't know our communities as well as we think
Yeah,
we do.
yeah.
Yeah.
Agreed. I see some questions here about also a lot of young adults are reading books they cannot take home or check out.
Hmm.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Hmm.
What is this about that many teens can't take books about sexuality home? Oh, I see, because their parents would object. Is that
Right.
it? Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Or yeah, yeah, and then also, they don't perhaps are not ready to disclose, or they don't want to be outed or things
Yeah.
like right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, great example. If any of you are in small town libraries or go to, this is from Tuscola, Illinois, which is right near here, Champaign Urbana. It's a little town, and when this happened, there was only one internet terminal in that was available to the public. And while a group was visiting a tour of from the library school here, um, one of the librarians came up and said to a 14-year-old, I'm going to tell your mother that you're looking at this. And it was a site about sexuality for
Mhm.
teens. It wasn't in any way obscene. It was an information site. And that just, you have to be so careful in small towns where to protect the privacy of young people, of everybody, but especially young people.
Yeah, and I would wager also, in any siting, right?
Yeah.
Big systems that have branches, et cetera. I wanted to, while we have a few minutes left, if people have any additional questions that they would like to pose to Dr. Jones, I wanted to go back because it struck me when you were giving that example about having a conversation in a library with the gentleman in the overalls,
Yeah.
and they asked him to leave because
Yeah.
they felt he wasn't being politically correct. And I
Yes.
agree with you about extending grace to people,
Yeah.
because this is a lot of topics and concepts may be new. Now, if this was something where he continued to say
Yeah.
certain things, that's a different issue.
Exactly.
um, yeah, but just I wanted to give an example. My colleague here at the University of South Carolina, Dr. Vanessa Kitsey. I presented with her last month, and I saw her do something that I had never seen done in a presentation, which was so, just so generous, and it really was effective. Dr. Kitsey has her safe zone training, and that is
Mm.
essentially allyship training for LGBTQ communities. And she started her presentation by telling the audience, I do safe zone presentations. And she said, there are no dumb questions. She said,
Ah.
so before we get started, I want you to ask me all of your questions about pronouns, or what's appropriate to ask, what's not appropriate to ask. She
Mm.
said, I want us to be able to all be on the same page, and I want us to all be able to feel like we can ask these questions, because if there's this underlying tension or this problem where people aren't on the same page, the conversation may not be as effective as it could
Yeah.
be,
Yeah.
because people are afraid, or they're hesitant, they're frustrated, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that, because yeah, I ask a lot of stupid questions all the time, and I am so grateful for the grace that has been shown to me over the years, and so I try to do that as well. And it's tough and it's exhausting work, but I think it's really the most important work we're doing these days.
Yeah, definitely. For Jordan, I just typed in the website, thesafezoneproject.com,
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
and they have their entire curriculum online
Oh,
that you
wow.
could go through. Yeah,
Okay.
and their site is really interesting, because they are the ones known to do all the training. And there's a part in their website saying, we honestly just can't keep up with all of these trainings.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Wow.
so this is part of the reason that they have graciously extended their curriculum, and also, just to have greater reach.
Yeah.
Because, just to the previous comments, there could be a community, a group of teens that really want this training, and may not feel safe going to the training, or
Mm-hmm.
because people would
Sure.
see them, or things
Yeah.
of that
Yeah.
nature. So there's a lot to be said for passive programming websites that have
Mm.
curriculum and really good content
Good point.
available
Yeah.
that people can go to privately or
Yeah.
individually.
Yeah. Good. Yes. That is a good point.
All right. Are there any last minute questions or comments for Dr. Jones? All right. Well, with that, Dr. Jones, thank you so very much again for coming to spend some time with us and talking about, really challenging topics, but topics that we
Yeah.
really need to be comfortable being uncomfortable with if they do indeed make
Yeah.
us uncomfortable, and we have to be, ready, willing, and able to do this work when we're in our libraries and communities.
Thank you. And I want to say to the group, please consider doing this work. My specialty in libraries was intellectual freedom for 40 years. It is so painful, and some of the work, not all, but it really makes you think. It really makes you dig deeply. And I met the most amazing people in libraries through this. I think some of the librarians in this work, many are just incredible human beings. And so I would urge you to get into intellectual freedom work or into social justice work in libraries. It sustained me for all this time, and I still find it fascinating, even though it's very hard.
Very hard, but very rewarding, and
Yes, yes.
there's no shortage of work for us to do. So,
Oh, right. Yes, thank you.
all right. So, with that, thank you all so much for joining us
Yes, thank
today.
you.
Always glad to see my students,
Yeah,
and very grateful to see some special guests, some very special librarians
yes,
that do this work in the field. Grateful
yes,
for you joining us today as well.
yes,
All right. So, with that, everyone stay safe and stay well, and we will
yes.
continue our lecture series next week.
Great. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Be well.
Have a good evening.